There are moments in life that stop everything. Moments where the world keeps spinning, but you just can't move. For Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognized faces in American television, that moment came without warning. It came quietly, the way the worst things always do. One day, everything looked normal from the outside. The polished studio lights, the perfectly timed smile, the confident voice delivering the morning news to millions of homes across the country. But behind that camera, behind that composed exterior, something was breaking, something deeply personal, something that no amount of professionalism could fully hide. A case had emerged, a story that wasn't just a headline, it was connected to real people, real grief, real unanswered questions, a missing mother, a family shattered by silence, and somehow, Savannah Guthrie found herself not just reporting the story, but emotionally entangled in the weight of it. People who knew her said she wasn't the same. Colleagues noticed. Viewers noticed. The eyes that had always carried warmth now carried something heavier, something unresolved. And then came the twist, a new development so unexpected, so deeply unsettling, that even seasoned journalists went quiet. The kind of twist that makes you question everything you thought you understood. What really happened? What did Savannah know? And why does this case keep pulling her back, even now? Stay with us, because this story is far from over. To understand why this story matters, why it cuts so deep, you first have to understand who Savannah Guthrie really is. Not the anchor, not the brand, the person. Savannah Guthrie was born on December 27, 1971, in Melbourne, Australia, where her father was stationed for work. She grew up moving. Tucson, Arizona became home base, a desert city where summers are relentless and the skies stretch wide and endless. There was nothing flashy about her childhood. Her father passed away when she was just 16 years old. 16. That age when you're just starting to figure out who you are, and suddenly, the foundation shifts beneath your feet. She leaned into her mother, into books, into purpose. She studied journalism and went on to earn a law degree from Georgetown University. Not because she needed a fallback, but because she genuinely wanted to understand the world with precision. She passed the bar. She could have been a lawyer, but television called, and she answered. She climbed steadily, carefully, local stations, national correspondences, NBC News, The Today Show. By the time she became co-anchor alongside Matt Lauer and later Hoda Kotb, she had built something real, a career rooted not in spectacle, but in substance. Off camera, she married attorney Michael Feldman in 2014. They have two children, Vale, born 2014, and Charlie, born 2016. She has spoken openly about her fertility journey, about the quiet heartbreak of wondering if motherhood would ever come. She has talked about her faith, a steady, private faith that grounds her when everything else feels uncertain. That's the person behind the anchor desk, a woman who has known loss, who has fought quietly for the things she loves, who has built a life with deep intention. So when a story about a missing mother lands on her desk, a mother who vanished without explanation, leaving behind children who needed answers, it doesn't just become news, it becomes something personal, something that reaches into the parts of Savannah Guthrie that the camera never fully captures. And that is exactly where this story truly begins. The case had been building for months before it broke into national consciousness. A mother, gone, not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way at first, just gone. The kind of disappearance that starts with worried texts going unanswered, then missed pickups, then a front door that no one answers no matter how many times you knock. Her name doesn't matter right now. What matters is what she represented. A woman in the middle of her life. A woman with children who went to bed every night wondering where she was. A woman whose absence created a silence so loud it echoed through an entire community. Local investigators worked the case quietly at first. Standard protocol. Check the phone records, talk to the neighbors, review the surveillance footage from nearby businesses. But the early leads dried up fast. There were no signs of forced entry. No witnesses who saw anything definitive. No clear motive pointing in any obvious direction. Just a woman who had been there, and then wasn't. When the story reached the national news cycle, it arrived almost gently. A brief mention here, a short segment there. But something about it refused to fade. The details were too human, too raw. The children too young. The questions too loud. And when Savannah Guthrie began to follow the story more closely, people inside the newsroom noticed a shift in how she approached it. This wasn't just another assignment to her. Something in the details had quietly, powerfully found her in a very personal place. Sources close to the production described Savannah as unusually invested. She asked more follow-up questions than typical. She requested updates before they were formally filed. She sat longer with the research materials than the segment timeline ever required. To some, it looked like a journalist who had finally found her defining story. But to those who knew her better, who understood the texture of her life, the losses she had carried, the quiet fear every parent holds somewhere deep, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like a woman who saw herself in this case. Not literally, not in any dramatic, self-inserting way, but in the way that certain stories find certain people at certain moments. The missing mother had children close in age to Savannah's own. The woman had, by all accounts, been present, engaged, fiercely devoted to her family. And then one morning, the ordinary routine simply didn't happen. That detail, the ordinary morning that became the last one, seemed to stay with Savannah in a way that words couldn't easily explain. Colleagues said she spoke about the case in the green room before broadcasts. She brought it up in editorial meetings when others had already moved on to newer stories. She kept circling back, as though leaving it unresolved felt like a personal failure. And then the investigation took a turn that absolutely no one had anticipated. A new piece of evidence surfaced, not dramatic at first glance, but when placed beside everything else that had been gathered, it completely changed the shape of the entire story. The new evidence was a digital trail, partial, fragmented, but unmistakably real. Investigators had recovered a series of communications, messages sent in the days before the woman disappeared, that suggested her situation was far more complicated than anyone had publicly acknowledged. She hadn't simply vanished into thin air. She had, it appeared, been afraid. The messages were guarded in language, the way people write when they know someone else might one day read their words. But the fear was legible underneath the careful phrasing. She had reached out to at least two people in her life, not law enforcement, not family, but individuals who existed on the quieter edges of her world. People she apparently trusted with whatever she couldn't say out loud. What those conversations contained, in full, was still being processed by investigators. But fragments had leaked, as they always do, into the wider conversation. And when the media began to piece together what those fragments suggested, the story transformed overnight. This was no longer a missing persons case with clean, tragic edges. This was something darker, something layered, something that pointed toward a life lived under a kind of tension that the people closest to her may never have fully seen. Savannah covered the development on air with the steady professionalism that had always defined her career. But those watching closely, those who had been following her relationship to this story, saw something flicker beneath the composure, something that looked unmistakably like grief. There's a particular kind of grief that journalists carry and rarely talk about. It is the grief of proximity, of spending weeks, sometimes months, living inside someone else's tragedy, reading their texts, reviewing their photographs, learning the names of their children, building, in your mind, a complete picture of a life, and then sitting with the devastating reality that something terrible interrupted that life. Savannah had been in this business long enough to know how to manage that distance. She had covered wars, disasters, political upheavals that reshaped the world. She knew the professional mechanisms for keeping yourself intact while telling other people's stories. But this case seemed to reach past those mechanisms entirely. Perhaps it was the timing, a period in her own life when questions of family, security, and the fragility of ordinary days were sitting very close to the surface. Perhaps it was the specificity of the details, the way they mirrored her own world just closely enough to feel deeply personal. Or perhaps it was something simpler. Perhaps Savannah Guthrie, underneath every title and credential, is just a person who heard about a mother who disappeared and couldn't fully separate herself from the horror of that. And in that inability to fully separate, in that refusal to let the story become just a story. She was more human than any award or accolade could ever measure. She kept pushing for answers. She kept asking the questions others had moved past. She kept the story alive, on air, in conversation, in the quiet. Relentless persistence of a journalist who refused to let a woman's disappearance become a footnote. And then, the shocking twist arrived, the development that would change the entire trajectory of the case, and of Savannah's public engagement with it, came not from law enforcement, not from a leaked document, but from someone completely unexpected. A person who had been silent for months suddenly stepped forward. Someone from the missing woman's past. Someone who had been carrying information for reasons that were complicated and human, and ultimately tragic. Their account introduced a dimension to the case that no investigator had publicly considered before. It didn't resolve the disappearance, not yet, but it reframed everything. The woman hadn't been simply living her life and then vanishing. She had been navigating a situation that placed her in a specific, dangerous kind of risk. The kind that often goes invisible until it is far too late. The kind that doesn't leave marks that are easy to read from the outside. When this account became part of the public record, the response was immediate and enormous. Advocates spoke out. Legal experts weighed in. The story surged back to the very top of the news cycle with renewed, urgent force. And at the center of that coverage, steady, careful, visibly moved, was Savannah Guthrie. She conducted interviews that week with a precision and an empathy that people genuinely noticed. She wasn't sensationalizing. She wasn't performing grief. She was doing the thing that the very best journalists do. She was bearing witness. She was insisting that this woman's story be told with the fullness and dignity it deserved. What followed in the weeks after that revelation was a period of intense public scrutiny, both of the case itself and of the people covering it. Social media, as it always does, generated noise and heat in equal measure. Some praised the coverage. Some criticized the level of attention given to one case while others went unnoticed. Some directed their commentary towards Savannah personally, questioning her objectivity, questioning her emotional investment, questioning whether a journalist who cared this visibly could still be trusted to report fairly. Savannah, to her credit, did not retreat. She addressed the criticism with directness and grace. She acknowledged her emotional connection to the story, while firmly defending the integrity of her reporting. She made the case publicly and without apology that caring about a story does not compromise it, that empathy and accuracy are not in conflict, that journalism, at its very best, is not performed from a position of cold detachment, but from a position of genuine, committed humanity. It was, many felt, one of the most honest things she had said publicly in years. Not a polished statement, not a media-trained response, just a person explaining, as clearly as they could, why some stories matter more than others, and why that mattering is not a weakness, but a responsibility. The public response was largely supportive, but the case itself remained unresolved. The missing mother was still missing. The investigation continued, and Savannah continued to follow it, because that was the only thing that made any sense to her. Months passed. The investigation moved through its slow, grinding process. There were updates, some that raised hope, some that quietly extinguished it. There were press conferences that answered 3 questions and somehow created 7 more. There were moments when clarity seemed close, and then moments when everything went quiet again, and the silence felt heavier than it had before. Through all of it, Savannah remained a consistent, grounding presence in the coverage. She checked in publicly, updating her audience when there was something substantive to report. She amplified the voices of advocates working the case. She used her platform not to center herself, but to keep the story's essential question alive. What happened, and does this woman's family deserve to know? In her personal life during this period, sources describe Savannah as someone processing a kind of weight that doesn't entirely leave. When you walk off the set, she spent time with her children with the particular, fierce intensity of a parent who has been sitting too close to a story about loss. She leaned into her faith. She leaned into her friendships. She did what people do when the work they have chosen brings them face to face with the hardest parts of being human. She found the small things that hold you together and held onto them tightly. There was also, during this period, a quiet reckoning happening within the broader conversation about missing persons cases, about which cases receive attention, which voices get amplified, which families are given the full resources of a national platform. And Savannah, to her credit, engaged with that reckoning with complete honesty. She acknowledged in conversations both on air and in interviews that the attention given to this particular case existed within a larger, uncomfortable context, that missing persons cases involving women of color, cases involving families without media connections, cases in communities without strong advocacy networks, those cases often never find the kind of sustained national coverage that this one had received. It was a moment of genuine self-reflection, and it wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. And the fact that she engaged with it, rather than deflecting or minimizing, said something deeply important about who she is as both a journalist and a person. Because the easiest thing, when you are at the center of a story that is gaining you visibility and credibility, is to simply not interrogate the conditions that made that possible. The harder thing is to look directly at those conditions and say, there's inequity here, and I have to name it, even when naming it complicates my own position. Savannah named it, and the conversation that followed, in newsrooms, on social media, in editorial meetings, was richer and more honest because she did. The missing mother case was no longer just a case. It had become, in some ways, a prism, a way of seeing multiple truths at once, about grief, about media, about the stories we choose to tell, and the ones we quietly let disappear. And at the center of that prism, holding her ground with unwavering clarity and care, was Savannah Guthrie, still asking questions, still absolutely refusing to let go. Some stories don't end cleanly. Some cases stay open, not because the people involved have stopped caring, but because the truth is still slowly making its way toward the light. And sometimes, the most important thing a person can do, journalist, viewer, neighbor, human being, is simply refuse to look away. Savannah Guthrie didn't have to make this case her own. She had every professional reason to cover it at arm's length, report the facts, and move forward. But she chose something harder and more honest. She chose to let it matter. And in doing so, she reminded all of us that caring, really, deeply caring, about someone else's story is not a liability. It is the whole point. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the cases that never make the news, the mothers who disappear without a platform to amplify their absence, pay attention. Look at what is happening in your own community. Advocate for the families who are asking the same questions with none of the visibility. Because every missing person is someone's entire world. Every unanswered question is a wound that stays open. And every person who refuses to let a story fade, whether they have millions of viewers or just one quiet, steady voice, is doing something that genuinely matters. Subscribe if you want to keep following stories that deserve to be told. And leave your thoughts below, because this conversation is far from finished.